I watched through my kitchen window as the black SUV barreled down my private farm road at 40 miles per hour. Mud and gravel sprayed in all directions as the vehicle hit the soft patch I had been preparing for weeks. The engine revved frantically as the wheels spun deeper into the thick, sticky clay that had been my grandfather's curse and was now my salvation. The driver's door flew open and out stepped Corinne's sister number one, her designer heels sinking immediately into the muck. She screamed something I could not quite hear from this distance, but I knew exactly what she was thinking. For months, these entitled women had treated my 40-acre farm like their personal highway, destroying my roads and disrespecting my property. But today was different. Today, they were stuck, and I was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. My name is Jake, and I am a third-generation farmer who inherited 40 acres of the most beautiful land you have ever seen. Every morning, I wake up before dawn to the sound of roosters calling and cattle lowing in the distance. The mist rises from the pastures like something out of a painting, and I feel grateful for every single day I get to work this land. My grandfather built this farm with his own hands back in 1952. He cleared the trees, dug the irrigation ditches, and laid every single stone in the foundation of our old farmhouse. When he passed 5 years ago, he left me everything. Not just the land, but the responsibility that comes with it. This place is not just my home. It is my legacy. The property sits on a gentle hill surrounded by rolling fields of corn and soybeans. We have a small herd of cattle, some chickens, and a vegetable garden that produces enough food to feed half the county. The main road runs along the eastern edge of my property, curving around the hill in a wide arc that adds maybe 3 minutes to anyone's drive to town. But there are also private roads that cut directly through my land. These are working roads, built for tractors and farm equipment. They connect my barn to the back pastures and provide access to the irrigation system that keeps everything green and growing. These roads are marked as private property, but they also happen to create a convenient shortcut for anyone who wants to avoid the main road. For the first few years after I inherited the farm, nobody bothered me. Neighbors respected the boundaries and life was peaceful. I would spend my days working the fields, maintaining equipment and caring for the animals. In the evenings, I would sit on the front porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. That peaceful existence started to change about 6 months ago. I first noticed it on a Tuesday morning when I was checking the irrigation lines in the back 40. Fresh tire tracks cut deep into the soft earth where no vehicle should have been. The tracks were wide and aggressive, clearly from a large SUV or truck that had been moving fast. I followed the tracks and discovered they led from the main road, cut straight through my property, and connected to the county road on the other side. Someone had used my private farm roads as a shortcut, and they had done it without permission. The tracks damaged the carefully maintained surface I had spent years perfecting. At first, I thought it was just a one-time thing. Maybe someone got lost or had an emergency. But over the next few weeks, the tracks appeared again and again. Always fresh, always cutting deeper into my roads. Someone was making a habit of trespassing on my property, and I was starting to get angry. I did not have to wait long to meet my uninvited guests. On a Thursday morning in late spring, I was repairing a section of fence when I heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching fast. I looked up to see a black Cadillac Escalade racing down my private road, throwing up a cloud of dust and gravel. The SUV screeched to a halt when the driver spotted me standing by the fence. The window rolled down, and I got my first look at Corinne's sister number one. She was probably in her 40s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and makeup that looked like she had just left a salon. Her expression was one of pure annoyance, as if my presence on my property was somehow inconvenient to her. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that dripped with entitlement. "You are blocking the road." I walked over to the vehicle, trying to keep my tone polite and reasonable. "Ma'am, this is a private road. You are on my property right now. The public road is about half a mile that way." I pointed toward the main road. She stared at me like I had just spoken in a foreign language. "This is not a private road. This is a shortcut to the subdivision. Everyone uses it." "I am sorry, but you are mistaken. This is my farm and these are my private roads. I am going to have to ask you to turn around and use the main road." That is when she showed her true colors. Her face twisted into a sneer and she leaned out the window. "Look, farm boy, I do not have time for your games. I have places to be and this road saves me 10 minutes. You cannot stop me from using it." Before I could respond, she gunned the engine and roared past me, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust. I watched her taillights disappear around the bend, my jaw hanging open in disbelief. In all my years of living on this farm, I had never encountered such blatant disrespect for private property. But Karen's sister number one was not finished with me. 2 days later, she was back, and this time she brought backup. I was working in the barn when I heard not one but two vehicles approaching. I stepped outside to see the same black Escalade followed by a white BMW SUV, both speeding down my road like they owned the place. This time, both vehicles stopped when they saw me. The second driver was related to the first. Same blonde hair, same entitled expression, same complete lack of respect for boundaries. They had to be sisters, and they were both furious that I dared to exist on my property. "We heard you were giving people trouble about using this road," the second sister said, her voice sharp with accusation. "This is private property," I repeated, trying to stay calm. "You do not have permission to be here." "We live in Meadowbrook Estates," the first sister snapped. "This road is a public thoroughfare. We have every right to use it." I tried to explain that Meadowbrook Estates was a new subdivision built on the other side of my property, and that the developers had no right to designate my private roads as public access. But they were not interested in listening to reason. "You are just some backward farmer who does not understand how the real world works," the second sister said with a laugh. "This is 2023, not 1950. You cannot just block roads because you feel like it." "We are going to keep using this road whether you like it or not," the first sister added, "and there is nothing you can do to stop us." With that, both vehicles roared to life and sped away, leaving me standing in another cloud of dust. I watched them go, my hands clenched into fists. These women had declared war on me, and they thought they had already won. Over the next few weeks, the sisters made good on their threat. They began using my private roads as their highway, sometimes multiple times per day. They would speed through during morning rush hour, race back during lunch, and tear through again in the evening. Each time, they drove faster and more aggressively, as if they were trying to prove a point. I tried everything I could think of to stop them. I put up signs at every entrance to my property, clearly marking the roads as private and warning against trespassing. The sisters simply ignored them, driving past the signs without slowing down. Next, I tried placing orange traffic cones across the road. The sisters drove around them, knocking several over in the process. I found the cones scattered in the ditch, some of them cracked and broken. Desperate for a solution, I bought a chain and stretched it across the road between two posts. I figured that would surely stop them. But when I checked the next morning, the chain was lying on the ground, cut clean through with bolt cutters. The sisters had come prepared. The damage to my property was getting worse with each passing day. The constant heavy traffic was destroying roads that had taken me years to properly maintain. Deep ruts appeared in the soft spots where the vehicles had spun their wheels. The gravel surface was scattered and uneven, making it difficult for my tractor to navigate. But the road damage was not the worst part. The sisters were driving so fast and carelessly that they were disturbing my livestock. My cattle, who had always been calm and docile, were now nervous and skittish. They would scatter whenever they heard vehicles approaching, sometimes running into fences or getting separated from the herd. One morning, I discovered that the sisters had driven straight through a section of temporary fencing I had set up to rotate the cattle to fresh pasture. The fence was destroyed, and 6 head of cattle had wandered onto the neighboring property. It took me 3 hours to round them up and repair the damage. I tried talking to them again, hoping that maybe they would listen to reason if I explained how their actions were affecting my livelihood. But when I flagged down the first sister near the main road, she just laughed at me. "You should have thought about that before you tried to block a public road," she said with a smirk. "Maybe if you had been more cooperative from the beginning, we could have worked something out." "This is not a public road," I said for what felt like the 100th time. "This is my property and you are damaging it." "Prove it," she shot back. "Show me the deed that says you own this road." I was so frustrated I could barely speak. Of course, I owned the road. It was part of my property, clearly marked on every survey and deed. But she was not interested in facts. She was interested in bullying me into submission. The situation got even worse when the sisters started bringing friends and family members through my property. Soon, I was dealing with 4 or 5 vehicles per day, all of them speeding through my roads like they were on a highway. The noise, the dust, and the damage were becoming unbearable. I tried calling the county sheriff, but the deputy who responded was not very helpful. He explained that property disputes were civil matters and that I would need to go through the courts if I wanted to stop the trespassing. He suggested I contact a lawyer, but made it clear that law enforcement was not going to get involved unless someone was physically threatened or injured. The sisters must have found out about my call to the sheriff because the next day they were more aggressive than ever. They honked their horns as they drove past my house, revved their engines loudly, and made sure to kick up as much dust as possible. They were taunting me, daring me to do something about it. That night I sat on my front porch and watched the sunset, just like I had done every evening for the past 5 years. But the peace and tranquility were gone. My sanctuary had been invaded, and I felt helpless to stop it. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in early June. I was doing my usual morning chores when I heard the familiar sound of vehicles approaching fast. But this time, something was different. Instead of the usual roar of engines passing by, I heard a loud crash followed by the sound of rushing water. I dropped the feed bucket I was carrying and ran toward the sound. What I found made my blood boil. The sisters had been racing through my property so recklessly that one of them had clipped the main irrigation line that fed my vegetable garden and part of my pasture. Water was gushing out of the broken pipe, flooding the road and turning the area into a muddy mess. But they had not stopped. They had not even slowed down. I could see their tire tracks continuing down the road, leaving me to deal with the damage they had caused. The water was flowing fast, washing away topsoil and creating erosion channels that would take months to repair. I ran back to the house to shut off the main water valve, but it was too late. Thousands of gallons of water had already been lost, and the damage was extensive. The irrigation system that my grandfather had installed decades ago was destroyed. The pipe would need to be completely replaced, along with several fittings and control valves. As I stood there surveying the damage, I felt something inside me snap. This was not just about trespassing anymore. This was about my livelihood, my family's legacy, and my ability to make a living from the land. The sisters had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I spent the rest of the morning calling contractors to get estimates for the repairs. The lowest bid was $1,200, not counting the cost of lost water and potential crop damage. That was money I did not have sitting around, especially with the spring planting season putting a strain on my budget. When I tried to call the sisters to demand compensation for the damage, both of their phones went straight to voicemail. I left detailed messages explaining what had happened and requesting that they contact me immediately. Neither of them called back. 2 days later, I saw the first sister at the gas station in town. When I approached her, she pretended not to recognize me at first. But when I explained about the irrigation damage and showed her photos of the destruction, her response was shocking. "You cannot prove that was us," she said with a shrug. "Could have been anyone driving through there." "Your tire tracks were right there in the mud," I replied, my voice rising. "And you were the only ones who drove through that morning. Like I said, you cannot prove anything. Maybe you should have built better irrigation lines if you did not want them to get damaged." I stared at her in disbelief. Not only was she refusing to take responsibility for the damage, but she was blaming me for not building my property to withstand her reckless driving. That afternoon, I called the sheriff's office again. This time, I filed a formal complaint about the property damage and requested that charges be filed against the sisters. The deputy who took my statement was sympathetic but not optimistic. "Without witnesses or video evidence, it becomes a he said she said situation," he explained. "Property damage cases are tough to prosecute, especially when the defendants deny responsibility." He suggested I install security cameras to document future incidents, but warned me that even video evidence might not be enough to secure a conviction. The legal system was not designed to handle this type of harassment, and I was essentially on my own. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about my grandfather and all the work he had put into this land. He had fought through the Great Depression, World War II, and decades of farming challenges to build something lasting. Now, two entitled women were destroying his legacy because they could not be bothered to drive an extra 3 minutes to town. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done trying to reason with the sisters. I was done relying on law enforcement to solve my problems. It was time to take matters into my own hands. I spent the morning walking my property, studying the terrain, and thinking about the natural features that made some areas more challenging to navigate than others. My grandfather had always said that the land would provide everything you needed if you knew how to work with it. It was time to put that wisdom to the test. I spent the next week carefully observing the sisters' routine. They were creatures of habit, always taking the same route at the same times. The first sister would speed through around 7:30 in the morning on her way to work, taking the shortcut to save time during rush hour. The second sister would follow about an hour later, usually talking on her phone while she drove. They always entered my property at the same point, where my private road connected to the main highway. From there, they would race down the hill, cut through the middle section of my farm, and exit onto the county road that led to their subdivision. The entire journey took them about 3 minutes, compared to the 8-minute drive they would have to make if they used the proper roads. But there was one section of their route that had always been problematic, even for me. About halfway through their shortcut, The road dipped into a low area that collected runoff from the surrounding fields. My grandfather had always called it the Hollow, and he had warned me to be careful driving through it during wet weather. The soil in the hollow was different from the rest of my property. Instead of the sandy loam that made up most of my fields, this area was heavy clay that would turn into thick, sticky mud when it got wet. During dry spells, the surface would bake hard and crack, but add a little water and it became like quicksand. I had always known this, but I had never thought of it as an advantage before. The sisters, with their heavy SUVs and aggressive driving, had been managing to power through the hollow because the spring had been relatively dry. But what if I could change the conditions? My irrigation system was more extensive than most people realized. In addition to the main lines that fed my crops, I had secondary lines that could be used for dust control and road maintenance. One of these lines ran right along the edge of the hollow, and with a little creativity, I could redirect the water flow. I spent several days working on the modifications, installing a temporary valve system that would allow me to flood the hollow on command. I disguised the work as routine maintenance, making sure that everything looked natural and legitimate. If anyone asked, I was simply fixing drainage issues that had been caused by the recent heavy traffic. The beauty of the plan was that it required perfect timing. I would need to flood the area just enough to soften the clay without making it obvious that the road had been sabotaged. Too much water and it would look intentional. Too little, and the sisters would power through it like they always did. I also needed to make sure I had witnesses and documentation. This could not look like a trap, even though that is exactly what it was. I set up a trail camera disguised as a birdhouse, positioning it where it would capture the entire event. I also prepared a detailed log of all the previous trespassing incidents, complete with dates, times, and photos of the damage. The weather forecast was perfect for my plan. A light rain was expected on Thursday night, which would provide natural cover for the wet conditions. I could flood the hollow on Friday morning and make it look like the rain had simply collected in the low-lying area. I spent Thursday evening making final preparations. I checked the valve system one more time, tested the trail camera, and made sure I had everything I needed to document the event. This was my one chance to end the harassment without breaking any laws or causing any real harm. The sisters would be stuck, but they would not be injured. They would be embarrassed, but they would not be in danger. And most importantly, they would finally understand that actions have consequences. I went to bed early that night, but I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if the sisters decided to take a different route? What if they called the police and accused me of sabotage? What if the plan backfired and made the situation worse? But I also thought about my grandfather and the legacy he had left me. He had not built this farm so that entitled strangers could use it for their convenience. He had built it to be protected, preserved, and passed down to future generations. Friday morning arrived with gray skies and the smell of rain in the air. I woke up before dawn and made my way to the control valve. It was time to put my plan into action. At exactly 7:15 on Friday morning, I opened the irrigation valve and watched as water began flowing into the hollow. The clay soil absorbed the moisture quickly, transforming from hard-packed earth into a soft, sticky mixture that would grab onto anything that tried to pass through it. I had timed it perfectly. The rain from the night before had already softened the ground, and my additional water made the surface look naturally wet. To anyone driving by, it would just appear that the hollow had collected rainwater, which was exactly what I wanted. I positioned myself in the barn where I had a clear view of the road but could not be seen by anyone approaching. The trail camera was recording everything, hidden in plain sight among the trees. All I had to do now was wait. At 7:28, I heard the familiar sound of the first sister's Escalade approaching from the main road. She was right on schedule, speeding down the hill toward the hollow like she had done dozens of times before. I held my breath as she approached the trap I had set for her. She hit the wet clay at full speed, probably doing 40 miles per hour. For a split second, it looked like she might power through it like she always did. But then the physics of the situation took over. The heavy SUV's momentum carried it forward, but the wheels began spinning uselessly in the thick mud. The engine revved frantically as she pressed harder on the accelerator, but that only made things worse. The spinning wheels dug deeper into the clay, and the vehicle began to sink. Within seconds, the Escalade was completely stuck, its undercarriage resting on the muddy surface. I watched through the barn window as the driver's door flew open, and the first sister climbed out. She was wearing a white business suit and high heels, completely inappropriate for the muddy conditions she now found herself in. Her designer shoes immediately sank into the clay, and she had to grab the door frame to keep from falling. She pulled out her phone and I could see her mouth moving, probably calling for help. But she was in the middle of my property, far from any main road, and her exact location would be difficult to explain to a tow truck driver. About 10 minutes later, the second sister arrived in her white BMW. She pulled up to the edge of the hollow and stopped, probably wondering why her sister's vehicle was sitting motionless in the middle of the road. I watched as she got out and walked carefully toward the trapped Escalade. The conversation between the sisters was animated, with lots of pointing and gesturing. The second sister tried to back up and find another route, but there was nowhere to go. The hollow was the narrowest point on the road, with drainage ditches on both sides. She was trapped behind her sister's vehicle with no way forward and no way around. That is when I decided to make my appearance. I walked slowly out of the barn, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing my usual work clothes. I wanted to look casual and unhurried, like I had just noticed the commotion. "Good morning, ladies," I called out as I approached. "Looks like you are having some trouble this morning." The first sister spun around, her face red with anger and embarrassment. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You did something to this road." "I am sorry, but I do not understand," I replied calmly. "This is just a natural low spot that collects water when it rains. It has been like this for as long as I can remember." "You are lying," the second sister joined in. "This road was fine yesterday." I shrugged and took a sip of my coffee. "Well, we did have quite a bit of rain last night. These clay soils can be tricky when they get wet." The first sister tried to walk toward me, but her heels kept sinking into the mud. She was stuck just as thoroughly as her vehicle, unable to move without risking a fall into the muck. "You need to get us out of here right now," she demanded. "We have important places to be." "I would be happy to help," I said, "but I am going to need a few things from you first, starting with an acknowledgement that this is private property and that you have been trespassing for months." "We are not admitting anything," the second sister snapped. "Just call a tow truck and get us out of here." I shook my head. "I am afraid it is not that simple. The nearest tow truck is in town, about 20 miles away, and they are going to need to know exactly where you are and how you got here. That means explaining that you were driving on private property without permission." The reality of their situation began to sink in. They were completely at my mercy, stuck in the middle of my property with no way out except through me. The tables had finally turned, and for the first time in months, I was the one in control. The next 4 hours were the most satisfying of my entire life. The sisters, who had spent months bullying and intimidating me, were now completely helpless. They were stuck in the mud, literally and figuratively, with no choice but to accept my terms. I offered them a simple deal. They would pay for the damage they had caused to my irrigation system, agree to never trespass on my property again, and sign a written acknowledgement that they had been in the wrong. In exchange, I would help them get their vehicles out of the mud and allow them to leave with their dignity intact. It took some negotiating, but eventually they agreed. The first sister wrote me a check for $1,500 to cover the irrigation repairs and my time. Both sisters signed a letter apologizing for their behavior and promising to respect my property rights in the future. The tow truck bill was another story entirely. It cost them nearly $800 to get both vehicles extracted from the mud, and that did not include the cost of cleaning the clay from their undercarriages. The first sister's designer suit was ruined, and the second sister's BMW needed complete detailing. But the real cost was to their pride. Word of the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon everyone knew about the entitled sisters who had gotten stuck while trespassing on a farmer's property. They became the laughingstock of their subdivision, and I never saw them on my roads again. The aftermath was everything I had hoped for and more. The trespassing stopped completely, not just from the sisters but from everyone else who had been using my property as a shortcut. The story of what happened in the hollow became a cautionary tale that kept other potential trespassers away. I used the money from the settlement to repair my irrigation system and upgrade my security cameras. The hollow returned to its natural state, and I made sure to keep the area well maintained so that it would not become a hazard for legitimate farm traffic. Looking back on the experience, I learned several important lessons. First, standing up for yourself sometimes requires creative thinking and patience. Second, that bullies only understand consequences, not reasoning. And third, that the land will always provide what you need if you know how to work with it. My grandfather would have been proud. He always said that respect had to be earned, and that sometimes the best way to earn respect was to show people that you would not be pushed around. The sisters learned that lesson the hard way, but they learned it thoroughly. The farm is peaceful again, just the way it should be. Every morning I wake up to the sound of roosters and cattle, and every evening I sit on my porch and watch the sunset. The difference is that now I know I can protect what is mine when I need to.